Louisville, Kentucky, 2018. Dr. Sarah Mitchell carefully lifted another box from the dusty corner of the Muhammad Ali Center's storage room. As the newly appointed curator of Ali's personal archives, she had been tasked with cataloging thousands of items that had been donated by the family over the years. Everything from childhood drawings to training notes, from fan letters to personal correspondence. It was meticulous work, but Sarah felt honored to be trusted with preserving the legacy of one of America's greatest icons. The August heat made the windowless storage room stifling, despite the air conditioning. Sarah wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and opened the cardboard box labeled Personal Items, 1978-1980. Inside, she found the usual mix: newspaper clippings, photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, and what appeared to be a small leather journal, its edges worn smooth by countless handlings. Sarah had been working in archives for 15 years, first at the Library of Congress, then at the Smithsonian, before accepting this position. She had developed an instinct for recognizing items of significance, and something about this journal made her handle it with extra care. The leather was soft, well-worn, suggesting it had been frequently used rather than simply stored away. Before I continue, I need to ask you something. This channel only exists because of you. You're important to me, and I know you value stories told with soul. If you feel something genuine just from this beginning, subscribe now. Seriously. It costs you nothing, but means everything to me who creates each story with love. Opening the journal, Sarah immediately recognized Ali's distinctive handwriting, the same flowing script she had seen in hundreds of documents over the past 6 months. The first few pages contained what appeared to be training notes and fight observations. Then, about halfway through, the tone changed. The writing became more personal, more reflective. And there, on page 37, was something unexpected. A poem. Not the playful rhymes Ali was famous for. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. But something deeper, more introspective. The title, written in careful block letters at the top of the page, read, "The Man Behind the Gloves." Sarah read the first few lines with growing amazement. They see the showman in the ring, the loudmouth with the golden swing. But in the quiet of the night, when all the cameras lose their sight. This wasn't the public Ali the world knew, the brash, confident champion who predicted his victories in rhyme. This was something more vulnerable, more human. Sarah quickly photographed the page with her phone and continued reading, her heart rate increasing with each stanza. The poem was dated March 15, 1979, a period when Ali was contemplating retirement. His skills clearly diminished, but his legend still growing. It painted a picture of a man wrestling with his public persona, questioning what would remain when the cheering stopped, when the spotlight finally moved on. Sarah immediately called her supervisor, Dr. Robert Henderson, the center's director. "Dr. Henderson, it's Sarah. I'm in storage room C, and I think I've found something extraordinary. An unpublished poem by Ali from 1979. It's unlike anything I've ever seen from him." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you certain it's authentic? Not something written about him?" The handwriting matches perfectly. It's in his personal journal, with his training notes and private thoughts. "And Bob? It's beautiful. Really beautiful. I'll be right down." 20 minutes later, Dr. Henderson stood beside Sarah's table, carefully examining the journal under a magnifying glass. A distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had been working with Ali memorabilia for over 2 decades. If anyone could authenticate this find, it was him. The paper is consistent with the period, he murmured, studying the pages. The ink, the handwriting style. Sarah, I think you may have discovered something remarkable here. As word of the discovery spread through the small staff of the Ali Center, an interesting picture began to emerge. None of Ali's family members Sarah contacted had any knowledge of this particular poem. It hadn't been included in any of the poetry collections published during his lifetime. It seemed to be genuinely unknown, a private moment of reflection that Ali had never chosen to share with the world. The question is, Dr. Henderson said, as they prepared to lock up for the evening, why did he keep this hidden? Ali was never shy about sharing his poetry, even the more personal pieces. What made this one different? Sarah looked at the photocopied pages in her hands. Maybe that's what we need to find out. Maybe there's a story here that's been waiting 39 years to be told. That night, Sarah took the photocopies home to her small apartment near downtown Louisville. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, reading the poem over and over again. Each time, she discovered new layers of meaning, new insights into the complex man behind the public image. The final stanza particularly moved her. When silence replaces the crowd's loud roar, and I'm just a man, nothing more, will they remember? Not just the fights I've won, but the person I was when the lights were gone? It was a question that seemed to anticipate the very situation Ali would find himself in years later. Suffering from Parkinson's disease, his voice reduced to a whisper, his once graceful movements slowed by illness. Even in 1979, already. Past his prime as a fighter, Ali seemed to understand that his greatest battles might be the ones fought away from the cameras, away from the adoring crowds. Sarah decided that this poem deserved to be shared with the world, but she wanted to understand its context first. Tomorrow, she would begin researching what Ali was going through in March 1979. Who was in his life? What might have prompted such introspective writing? This wasn't just an archival find. It was a window into Ali's soul that had remained, shuttered for nearly 4 decades. If this story has already made you feel something, however small it may be, don't leave without giving back. Comment and subscribe now. Over the next several days, Sarah immersed herself in Ali's life circa March 1979. What she discovered painted a picture of a man at a crossroads, both professionally and personally. Ali had lost his heavyweight title to Leon Spinks a year earlier in a stunning upset, then regained it later that same year in a rematch. He was 37 years old, and while still competitive, the signs of decline were becoming impossible to ignore. More significantly, this was the period when Ali was seriously considering retirement for the first time. His entourage was split, some urging him to quit while he was still champion, others encouraging him to continue fighting for the financial security it provided. The pressure was immense, and for perhaps the first time in his life, Ali seemed uncertain about his path forward. Sarah reached out to several people who had been close to Ali during that period. Most were elderly now, some had passed away, but a few were willing to talk. The most illuminating conversation came with Dr. Ferdy Pacheco, Ali's former physician and cornerman, who had left Ali's team in 1977 out of concern for the fighter's health. March of '79, Dr. Pacheco said during their phone interview, his voice still sharp despite his advanced age. I remember that time well, even though I wasn't with the team anymore. Ali was struggling with something that had nothing to do with boxing. He was questioning everything: his purpose, his legacy, what he meant to people beyond the entertainment value. Do you think he might have been writing during that period? Sarah asked. Something personal, reflective? Absolutely. Ali was always more thoughtful than people gave him credit for. The public persona, the rhymes, the boasting, that was show business. Privately, he was constantly examining himself, his role in the world. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he was putting those thoughts down on paper. Dr. Pacheco's words were encouraging, but Sarah wanted more context. She contacted several boxing historians and Ali biographers, eventually connecting with Thomas Hauser, who had written the definitive biography, Muhammad Ali, His Life and Times. "The period you're describing is fascinating," Hauser told her during their lengthy phone conversation. Ali was dealing with a lot of internal conflict. He was a fighter who hated violence, a man who craved the spotlight but sometimes wanted desperately to be left alone. By 1979, the contradictions in his life were becoming harder to reconcile. Sarah explained about the poem, reading several stanzas to Hauser. The author was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That's remarkable. It captures something I tried to convey in my book, that beneath all the bravado was someone trying to figure out who he really was when the cameras turned off. The fact that he never shared this publicly says something important about how personal and raw these feelings were for him." The more Sarah learned about Ali's state of mind in 1979, the more poignant the poem became. This wasn't just versification. It was a man wrestling with questions that would define the rest of his life. What was his true purpose? How would he be remembered? What happened when a larger-than-life figure was forced to confront his own mortality and humanity? Sarah decided to reach out to Ali's family directly. After several phone calls and emails, she managed to arrange a meeting with Lani Ali, Muhammad's widow, and the force behind much of his later charitable work. They met at the Ali Center on a quiet Tuesday morning, sitting in Lani's office overlooking the Ohio River. Lani, elegant and gracious despite the weight of years spent caring for her ailing husband, examined the poem carefully. Her expression grew increasingly thoughtful as she read. "This is definitely Muhammad's handwriting," she confirmed. "And it sounds like him. The real him, not the public version. He used to say to me, especially in his later years, that he wondered if people would remember anything about him besides the fights and the quotable lines." "Did he ever mention this specific poem to you?" Sarah asked. Lani shook her head. "No, but that's not surprising. Muhammad was a very private person in many ways. He kept journals sporadically throughout his life, and he rarely shared what he wrote in them, even with family. This feels like something he wrote for himself, to work through his own thoughts." As they discussed the poem's content, Lani provided insights that only someone who had lived with Ali could offer. The line about "when silence replaces the crowd's loud roar," that was something he actually experienced, you know? When the Parkinson's progressed and speaking became difficult for him, he would sometimes sit quietly for hours, just thinking. I wonder if he remembered writing these words decades earlier. Lani paused, looking out the window toward downtown, Louisville. Muhammad always said that boxing was just what he did, not who he was. But I think he sometimes struggled to define who he was beyond the ring. This poem suggests he was grappling with that question much earlier than most people realized. Before leaving, Sarah asked Lani for permission to make the poem public. "I think the world deserves to see this side of Muhammad. It adds depth to his legacy, shows him as more than just an athlete or an entertainer." Lani agreed, but with one condition. "I want you to tell the full story, not just the poem itself, but what it reveals about Muhammad as a person. Too often, people focus on the spectacle and miss the substance. This poem is all substance." That evening, Sarah sat, down to begin writing what would become a comprehensive article about the poem and its significance. But as she stared at her computer screen, she realized that the discovery had raised as many questions as it answered. Why had Ali kept this particular piece of writing private when he was generally so willing to share his thoughts with the world? What was happening in his life during those specific weeks in March 1979 that prompted such introspection? The more she thought about it, the more Sarah suspected there was still more to uncover about this hidden side of Muhammad Ali. The poem wasn't just a literary curiosity. It was a key to understanding the complex psychology of one of the most examined figures in modern history, and she was determined to unlock all the insights it could provide. Sarah's research led her to an unexpected source, Dr. Abraham Lieberman, a neurologist who had treated Ali for Parkinson's disease in the 1980s and 1990s. Though bound by doctor-patient confidentiality regarding specific medical details, Dr. Lieberman was willing to discuss the broader context of Ali's condition and its potential early manifestations. What many people don't realize, Dr. Lieberman explained during their meeting at his Phoenix office, is that Parkinson's symptoms can begin years before they become obvious. Subtle changes in handwriting, slight tremors, moments of unusual stillness or contemplation. These can precede diagnosis by a decade or more. Sarah showed him photocopies of pages from Ali's journal, including the poem. Dr. Lieberman studied them carefully, particularly examining the handwriting. "Interesting," he murmured. "The script is still fluid here, still characteristically Ali's style. But if you look closely at certain letters, there are tiny variations that might suggest the earliest stages of motor changes. Of course, this is speculation. Stress, fatigue, or simple aging could account for the same variations." "What does this mean for understanding the poem?" Sarah asked. It's possible that Ali was beginning to sense changes in himself that others couldn't yet detect. Athletes are incredibly attuned to their bodies. Even subtle alterations in coordination, thinking speed, or physical response can be alarming. To someone whose entire identity is built around physical perfection, Dr. Lieberman's observations added another layer to Sarah's understanding of the poem. Perhaps Ali's contemplation of life, when the lights were gone, wasn't just philosophical. Perhaps it was prescient, born from an unconscious recognition that his physical decline was beginning earlier than anyone knew. This theory was supported when Sarah discovered another piece of the puzzle. While reviewing Ali's fight footage from late 1978 and early 1979, she noticed something that sports commentators at the time had attributed to aging. Moments of unusual stillness, instances where Ali seemed to pause mid-combination for no apparent tactical reason. Subtle changes in his legendary footwork. Armed with this new perspective, Sarah reached out to Angelo Dundee, Ali's longtime trainer, who was still alive at the time, though quite elderly. Though Dundee was reluctant to discuss any perceived weaknesses in his former fighter, he eventually opened up about that particular period. "I'd been with Ali since the beginning," Dundee said, his voice raspy but still passionate when discussing his most famous student. "I knew every move he made, every habit, every tell. Around that time you're asking about, I started noticing little things. He'd hesitate sometimes when he'd never hesitated before. His combinations weren't quite as fluid. I thought it was just miles on the odometer. You know? Every fighter faces that, eventually. Did Ali ever mention feeling different? Sensing changes in himself?" Dundee was quiet for a long moment. He was more thoughtful than usual during that period, asking more questions about what came after boxing, what fighters did when they couldn't fight anymore. It wasn't like him to be so philosophical about it. Usually Ali lived in the moment, but around then he seemed to be thinking a lot about the future. Sarah realized she was assembling a Portrait of a man who was intuiting changes in himself that wouldn't be medically diagnosed for several more years. The poem wasn't just abstract contemplation. It was Ali processing his growing awareness that his career, and perhaps his life as he knew it, was entering a different phase. This revelation led Sarah to examine other materials from the same journal with fresh eyes. She found additional entries that revealed Ali's growing concern about his post-boxing identity. One passage, written just 3 days after the poem, read, "People keep asking when I'll retire, like it's just about picking a date. They don't understand that when I stop being Muhammad Ali the boxer, I have to figure out who Muhammad Ali the person really is. Been performing so long, sometimes I don't know where the act ends and the real me begins." The vulnerability in that passage was striking. Here was a man who had projected supreme confidence for 2 decades, privately admitting uncertainty about his own identity. The poem wasn't an isolated moment of doubt. It was part of a deeper process of self-examination that Ali was undergoing. Sarah's article about the discovery was growing into something more substantial, a psychological portrait of Ali during a crucial transition period, using the poem as a window into his private thoughts. But she felt there was still one more piece missing. That piece came from an unexpected source, Freeman McNeil, a former sparring partner of Ali's, who had maintained a friendship with the champion long after their boxing days ended. McNeil, now in his 70s and living in Las Vegas, had heard about Sarah's research through mutual acquaintances. "I was with Ali in March of '79, McNeil told her during a phone interview. "We were in Miami, doing some light training, but mostly just hanging out. He was different during that trip. Quieter. Usually Ali was always on, you know? Always performing. Always ready with a joke or a rhyme. But that week, he spent a lot of time alone, writing in a little book he carried." Sarah's heart raced. "Do you remember anything specific about his mood or what he was thinking about?" "Yeah, actually. One night, we're sitting by the pool at his hotel, and out of nowhere he asks me, 'Freeman, when you think about me 10 years from now, what do you think you'll remember?' I told him I'd remember the greatest fighter who ever lived, and he just shook his head. Said he hoped people would remember more than just the fighting." McNeil paused, the memory clearly still vivid after so many years. Then he said something that stuck with me. "I've spent so much time being what people wanted me to be, I'm not sure I know what I want me to be." That's when I knew something was weighing on him heavy. The pieces were falling into place. The E.E.Type poem wasn't just a literary exercise. It was Ali working through an identity crisis that would define the rest of his life. As his career wound down and his health began its gradual decline, he was confronting fundamental questions about purpose, legacy, and authenticity. Sarah now understood why Ali had never shared this particular poem. It was too personal, too vulnerable, too revealing of the uncertainty beneath his public bravado. But nearly 4 decades later, it offered a profound insight into one of the most complex figures in American history. A man who had spent his life in the public eye, but kept his deepest questions private until now. The Muhammad Ali Center buzzed with activity as Sarah prepared for the public unveiling of The Man Behind the Gloves. 3 months had passed since her discovery, months spent researching, interviewing, and crafting what had become not just an article, but a multimedia presentation about Ali's hidden vulnerabilities and private wrestling with identity. The event, scheduled for what would have been Ali's 77th birthday, had drawn an unexpected crowd. Boxing historians, literary scholars, family members, and ordinary fans filled the center's main auditorium. ESPN was streaming the presentation live, and several major newspapers had sent reporters to cover what many were calling the most significant Ali-related discovery in decades. Sarah stood backstage, the original journal in a climate-controlled case beside her, her hands slightly trembling with nervous energy. Dr. Henderson appeared at her elbow, offering a reassuring smile. "Ready for this?" he asked. "I think so," Sarah replied, straightening her jacket. "I just hope I do justice to what Ali was trying to express." As Sarah took the stage, she looked out at the faces in the audience. People of all ages and backgrounds united by their fascination with Muhammad Ali. In the front row sat Lani Ali, who had become not just a supporter of Sarah's work, but a collaborator, helping to ensure that the presentation honored her husband's memory appropriately. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice growing stronger as she settled into her presentation, "we gather today to honor not just Muhammad Ali, the boxing champion, not just Muhammad Ali, the cultural icon, but Muhammad Ali, the human being. Complex, vulnerable, and profoundly thoughtful in ways the public rarely saw." She began with the story of the discovery, then moved into her research about Ali's state of mind in 1979. Using slides and video clips, she painted a picture of a man at a crossroads, beginning to sense changes in himself that wouldn't become apparent to others for years to come. "The poem I'm about to share with you," Sarah said, "represents something rare in the Ali archives, a moment of complete authenticity when he dropped the public persona and confronted his own fears and uncertainties." The auditorium fell silent as Sarah began reading "The Man Behind the Gloves." Her voice was clear and measured, allowing the power of Ali's words to resonate throughout the space. "They see the showman in the ring, the loud mouth with the golden swing, but in the quiet of the night, when all the cameras lose their sight, I wonder who I really am, beyond this carefully crafted sham. The crowds they cheer for, pretty here. They love the boasts that mask my fear. But when the bell no longer sounds, and silence fills these hallowed grounds, what will remain of all I've done? What legacy when fighting's done?" As Sarah continued reading, she could see the impact of the words on the audience. Some people were wiping their eyes, others leaning forward intently, all of them discovering a side of Ali they had never known existed. "I am more than combinations thrown, more than the seeds of fame I've sown. Inside this shell of muscle, bone, lives a soul that stands alone, asking questions none can see. Who is Muhammad? Who is me? They say I float just like a bee, that I sting with poetry. But dancing shadows cannot last, and present soon becomes the past, when silence replaces the crowd's loud roar, and I'm just a man, nothing more. Will they remember, not just the fights I've won, but the person I was when the lights were gone? Beyond the bragging, beyond the show, will anyone care to really know the man who lived behind these gloves, the heart that hoped, the soul that loves?" When Sarah finished reading, the auditorium remained silent for several seconds before erupting in applause. She saw Lani Ali nodding appreciatively, tears glistening in her eyes. "What makes this poem so significant," Sarah continued after the applause subsided, "is not just its literary merit, though it certainly demonstrates Ali's underappreciated skill as a poet. What makes it significant is what it reveals about the Ahiui psychological journey Ali was undertaking in the late 1970s, a journey that would define the rest of his life." Sarah explained her research findings, the early signs of Parkinson's that Ali may have been sensing, the identity crisis he was experiencing as his boxing career wound down, the tension between his public persona and his private self. She showed clips of Ali from that period, pointing out the subtle changes that suggested he was already beginning to grapple with the decline that would become more apparent in later years. "The beautiful irony," Sarah said, as her presentation neared its conclusion, "is that this poem, which Ali wrote while questioning how he would be remembered, actually provides the answer to his question. Yes, we remember the fights, the championships, the quotable lines, but this poem shows us what Ali truly wanted to be remembered for: his humanity, his complexity, his willingness to question himself and grow as a person." The Q&A session that followed was passionate and lengthy. Boxing historians wanted to know about the implications for understanding Ali's later career decisions. Literary scholars were fascinated by the poem's structure and imagery. Fans simply wanted to discuss what this new insight meant for Ali's legacy. One question from a young woman in the back of the auditorium particularly resonated. "Do you think Ali would have wanted this poem to be shared publicly?" Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. "Based on my research and conversations with those who knew him, I believe Ali would want this poem shared now because it serves the purpose he ultimately came to embrace: helping people understand that greatness isn't just about what you achieve publicly, but about your willingness to examine yourself honestly and continue growing as a human being." This poem shows us that even at the height of his fame, Ali was still asking the questions that matter most. Who am I? What do I stand for? How do I want to be remembered? As the evening concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Lani Ali approached Sarah. "I think Muhammad would be pleased," she said warmly. "You didn't just share his poem. You helped people understand the man who wrote it. That's what he would have wanted most." In the months that followed, The Man Behind the Gloves became one of the most widely discussed pieces in the Muhammad Ali corpus. It was included in new editions of Ali's collected works, analyzed in literature classes, and quoted by speakers, addressing themes of identity, authenticity, and personal growth. More importantly, it changed how many people thought about Ali himself, not just as a legendary athlete and entertainer, but as a thoughtful human being wrestling with questions that resonate with everyone. Sarah often reflected on the poem's final stanza and how prophetic it had proven to be. Ali had worried about whether people would remember the person I was when the lights were gone. In his later years, as Parkinson's disease progressively silenced his voice and slowed his movements, the world had indeed come to see and appreciate the man behind the gloves, his gentleness, his charity work, his grace in facing illness, his role as a symbol of peace and reconciliation. The poem he had written in private in 1979, questioning how he would be remembered, had become its own answer. He would be remembered not just for floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee, but for having the courage to examine his own soul and share that examination with the world, even if it took nearly 4 decades for that sharing to occur. The end, The Man Behind the Gloves, served as a reminder that even the most public figures have private moments of doubt and self-reflection, and that true greatness often lies not in the absence of such moments, but in the wisdom and growth that can emerge from them. Muhammad Ali had given the world one final gift: proof that the questions that troubled him were not weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths to be celebrated, connecting him eternally to the shared human experience of wondering who we really are when no one else is watching. If you've made it this far and felt every word, don't leave without subscribing. I tell these stories with my heart in my hand to reach people like you, who feel, who get emotional, who live. If this truly touched you, give back, comment, subscribe. Come be part of this family with me until the next video.